of the Democracy Reporting International Judiciary Hub. Thank you very much for tuning in. We would like all to welcome you to the unveiling of our new tool, a go-to resource for experts and professionals inside or outside the legal field, trying to decode European Union's judicial jumble. This product in this event is part of reconstitution program supported by Stiftung Mercator, who is funding our work on the rule of law in the European Union. And just one disclaimer to begin with, we are recording this and we will upload this later to our YouTube channel. So in case you will have to drop out suddenly, you won't miss anything. Now, once again, thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to start with a little bit of how this is going to play out. I will, first of all, in a moment, turn the mic over to my colleague, Dr. Nino Tsereteli, to present the Judiciary Hub and to talk a little bit about what it is, what it's intended for, and what are its functionalities and how it could be potentially useful to all of you. Nino is a researcher with us at Democracy Reporting International, and the Judiciary Hub occupies a very special place in her heart as she's been driving this project forward for the last couple of years. And finally today, we are seeing this work come to fruition in terms of launching the Judiciary Hub. Nino is an accomplished researcher with experience in researching judiciaries and legal systems, especially in comparative perspective. And she's been working with us also on the reconstitution program on analyzing courts, judiciaries, and various developments related to the rule of law in the European Union. And after Nino will have the opportunity to present the tool, I'm going to turn over the microphone to our fantastic guests who were kind to pick the invitation and join us today. This Dr. Basia Grabowska-Moros, a research fellow at Central European University Democracy Institute. Basia is also a former fellow of the Reconstitution Program, so she's been a good friend of ours for a long time. And as part of her work at CEU, she is researching the rule of law crisis in the EU member states, with some particular focus on what's happening in Hungary and Poland, but also looking comparatively at what's happening across the board in the EU. We invited Basia not only because she's our good friend, but she's also a scholar who is frequently looking into comparative side of things and how do judiciaries in EU member states stack up against each other, and thus is bringing the academic perspective to our conversation today. Since I mentioned Hungary, then our second guest is Marta Pardavi, co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. If any of you have been following the rule of law crisis in Hungary, then you inevitably run into Marta. She's one of the most esteemed and recognized voices in advocacy and speaking up about what's happening in the country. Marta represents also part of our kind of family of friends and fellows of the Reconstitution Program, as she is on our advisory board. And she's also running a couple of projects such as Rare and Starlight, with whom we interact frequently. Marta brings us the advocacy and NGO perspective of work in the field, where frequently data about courts and judiciary system is needed to be looked up at a quick glance and is useful in the advocacy work. And finally, our third guest, and to make this event not only about people from Central and Eastern Europe, is Daniel Tils, chief editor of Notes from Poland. Daniel, a journalist who is running a operation, that's probably the best way to describe Notes from Poland, based around providing news from the country to the English speaker. And this year is the 5th anniversary of Notes from Poland operating in its current shape. And one of the consequences of bringing news to Poland, for instance, 2019 to the wider English-speaking world, is that you don't only cover pierogi and cultural developments, but also the rule of law crisis, which is probably challenging for journalists as much as it is for lawyers. So we welcome Daniel and very happy that he will provide us with a little bit of a perspective from the journalist side of things and how this tool could be useful for their work. Now, after all of our guests will have a chance to talk, we will have a brief Q&A session. So if you have any questions, it will be probably best if you put them down in the event chat or using the Q&A function, and we will try to grab as many of those as possible, although we might miss, unfortunately, one or two, since we are booked until 11 and we don't want to hold our esteemed guests too long. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. And now I'm going to turn over to Nino to present the tool and talk about what exactly the Judiciary Hub is and how hopefully it's going to be useful to all of us.
Thank you, Jakub. I will start with a short presentation just to explain our thinking behind the hub, and then I will go to the actual page and show you some of the features that you might find useful if you look at it. I'll share my screen first and so first of all, why judiciaries? The rule of law crisis and challenges are quite complex. So we concentrated only one aspect of this and particularly courts. And there are several reasons for this. One reason is that as research shows, democracies are more resilient when strong judicial constraints are in place on the executive, and they serve as a defensive wall against autocratization. However, their capacity to resist then decreases as the regime, authoritarian regime, becomes stronger. So courts have been particularly vulnerable to pressure and interference in certain countries, and we have witnessed the efforts and attempts at capturing and instrumentalizing courts or weakening them. And we would also notice, if you follow the developments, that there have been multiple instances when politicians have been abusing comparative arguments to justify some of the reforms. So we thought, for example, that they were saying that, for example, Polish disciplinary regime is modeled on the French one, or arguing that German judicial appointments are also politicized. So why criticize us, Poland and Hungary? So then our thinking was that there's a need for a resource that makes nuanced and multifaceted discussions possible, and also allows to break down this type of problems and make it understandable. So why the hub, why this instrument? We saw that there's abundance of data and analysis on the judiciaries. However, it's very much dispersed. So we thought that accumulating this data would make it much easier to navigate this landscape and follow also the developments that are very complex and fast-paced. So we thought that having such a resource would make following these developments easier. Another issue that we saw is that a lot of the material on the topic is very legalistic, and therefore it might be a bit difficult for those who are non-lawyers or non-academics to follow some of it. So we thought that we would present it in a more simple and accessible way. And finally, we thought that a comparative element is particularly important to really have this nuanced discussion and also respond to some of the misleading or abusive arguments that we hear often from politicians. So what are we doing? What are our objectives in particular here? So our main objective was to make finding information about, so go-to resource or one-stop shop for data and analysis on the judiciaries, justice systems of the EU member states. We mostly cover courts and prosecution here. So we feature a lot of the data that is available. This includes surveys, indexes, also data on the compliance with the European Court's judgments, also reports from civil society and academic work that is at variety of foreign platforms. But we also provide our own data and analysis, how we see problems in terms of how the system operates. And we hope that this database, this page would be helpful for the users with very different needs or levels of interest or knowledge about the judiciaries. I could imagine that the journalist that starts covering Poland and Polish judiciary or Hungarian judiciary would benefit from looking at how the system looks like, who makes decisions, who disciplines judges, who appoints them, etc. However, for somebody that has already some understanding of the systems, it might be helpful to look at the analysis of recent developments that we intend to provide, and which is already up there, but obviously with the new developments we are going to update, and also additional resources. We did compilation for each country of the existing resources that are out there, which you could, academic articles, blogs, etc., which you could take a look at. For somebody who engages with politicians, it might be helpful to take a look at also at the analysis of ongoing reforms and comparative analysis or good practices or standards, so as to assess, for example, some of the reform efforts or give recommendations or respond to some of those abusive and misleading statements. Our main priority was the accessibility for non-specialists, non-lawyers, this type of audiences, and we try to address this in a variety of ways. First of all, analysis is framed in a more simpler fashion, hopefully, with less jargon, and also we resorted to visualization of some of the data. And finally, we create the glossary, which explains some of the terms. And finally, we try with this to draw attention to some of the issues and states that do not get enough attention, so that we go through more comprehensive coverage across the EU, because as I mentioned already, we need to pay attention to some of the crisis, start of the crisis, so early stages where it's still possible to defend the judiciary. Here are the elements of our map, which I will shortly go to explain what are the features. At the center of the hub is the map, and then there are obviously country profiles of different level of detail and depth, and possibility to compare, glossary, and possibility to pick and choose and create your own reports about the particular judiciary. Now I will share the actual website so that I could show you what features are there. First of all, this is our homepage, and the first, so you could see that we feature some of the elements and also acknowledge some of the sources or where we took data from, which is also duly acknowledged elsewhere. And the main feature is the map, which is zoomed on, hopefully now on the European Union. Hope all of you see it. So our goal here was to map a number of parameters so as to allow for the comparison between them. Here, for example, you could compare how much money particular EU member states spend on the judiciary per inhabitant. And also you could, we also, for example, try to map various judicial governance systems to make sense of who stands where. In the north, we have mostly the court service model. In the south and Central and Eastern Europe, we have the different varieties of judicial council models. And then in the center, we have the Ministry of Justice model, for example, Germany and Czech Republic. And if these terms seem unfamiliar, that's not a problem, because you could go to the country profiles and see the breakdown of how particular models work, and also go to the glossary and glossary section here, and you could explain, you could see the explanation for particular models and the definitions. Then we grouped rankings based on three values: judicial independence, judicial integrity, and judicial court efficiency. And for each, we have multiple sources where with each of them, there is a specification of the of the source, and also you could see at the bottom of the page there's a timeline, so you could show the data for each year across this continuum. Then we obviously have more data on compliance with European courts judgments. And this is a data that comes from the DRI and also our partner European Implementation Network on the European Court of Human Rights. And every year we have a report, and the data from that report is reproduced in this database as well. Here you can see how the implementation record for the EU member states looks like for the European Court of Human Rights. And see, Poland a very serious problem, but then also Spain moderately poor. And there are other parameters based on which you could assess how well the states do. And finally, we have a list of challenges. These are not all challenges that we cover, but some of the more important ones. And for more extensive list, you could go to country profiles and see. But here you could see for each challenge, which are the countries that face that particular challenge. And it could be interesting also to see that maybe several countries face a problem with the legislative gap as regards to the prosecutorial independence, that there's an inadequate formal protection. However, if you dig deeper, go to the country profile, you would see that there's some differences in terms of the scope of the problem and the consequences of the problem. So it allows for a more nuanced analysis. This is just a starting point. And also, for example, the this concerning practice of top national courts challenging the European courts. You could see several countries, but then if you dig deeper, you would see how they differ in terms of how systematic this contestation is, or how who is a driver, whether it's a court itself or the government, etc. So then for each country, if you press, you'd see a short country profile, which gives some of the basic data about the country. But if you are interested in a more in-depth knowledge of the country and its judiciary, you go with the country profiles. It's a longer country profile. You could access it in a variety of ways, including from here, view full profile. And you could see full profile for Germany, for example. On the left-hand side, you have a structure for the country profile, which you could navigate and go through the variety of sections. It covers the judicial makeup, then the system of governance, challenges, which is the analytical section, which lists and gives sort of description to the problems with the indication of sources. So you could access much more broader range of information if you want to go through this channel here. And with the system of judicial governance, for example, that I mentioned before, there's this feature that you could press, and then you could see the definition. There's this for multiplicity of terms throughout the database. And then you have a variety of other rankings and surveys, experts' recommendations that you could check out with the links also indicated. The recommendations come from the civil society, as well as the EU and Council of Europe bodies, and sometimes even from the UN, as you see here. And we have data for the compliance with the European court's rulings, with summaries of some of the key judgments and data. Then there's a compare function, which allows you to pick and choose 5 states, 5 countries, and select a variable, for example, challenges. If you were to be interested, you have heard that Spain and Poland both have problems with the politicization of the Judicial Council. Then you would see how those crises differ. Or if you are interested in the Constitutional Court appointments and Portugal and Spain both had issues with it, then you could choose those 2 countries and see how different they are. So back to back, you'll see next to each other, you'll see the description of these problems. And this works for all the parameters, almost all the parameters throughout the instrument. Finally, you would have the glossary separately, which will extend as we'll extend the instrument, where you have the definitions for a variety of terms that you would use inside the variety of terms that we use inside the instrument. We intend to update Judiciary Map regularly, and if you were to see updates, you go to the homepage and you'd see if there's any new law or court judgment, it could be featured here, or if there is any analytical piece that we have written or are aware of, or indexes and surveys. So this would be aspects that we will update over time. And throughout the instrument, also there are a variety of ways in which you could export the data to the PDF or to Excel to make it, to keep it with you for a variety of functions. So I think I can stop here. If there are any questions later, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah, thank you. Back to you, Jakub.
Thank you very much, Nina, for this presentation. And I would also want to add that we will be releasing more updates and functionalities in the coming weeks and months as we plan to continue expanding the map. So there will be even more of this coming from us. But for now, let's say this is a good moment to turn over the microphone to our guest. And I will start with Basia, asking you about your reflection on this kind of tool and its usefulness in academic research and other angles of your work.
Thank you, Jakub. Thank you for the invitation. I hope you can hear me. I mean, my first thought was it looks like a little bit like CIA World Factbook. There is this web page when CIA actually analyzes all possible states around, starting from migration data to, alcohol consumption. But you stick just to judiciary, and that's a good way to go, since discussing court judiciary and rule of law is actually a big topic recently, and using comparative argument became the thing, and also in recent years, not just for political narrative, but also a kind of a challenge for legal methods, how to do the research when such comparative argument are being used. I mean, it's quite easy to compare hard data, but actually to create hard data in taking out of kind of soft data, if you say so, meaning how independent judiciary is, how given institution provides such guarantees for independence, it's quite difficult to translate the soft environment, if you can say so, into the hard data. I mean, you have kind of used the data already available, which is a good thing. You could also, I guess, think, whether other database could be also somehow linked with your website. I mean, the word rule of law index is just something that comes to your mind, which you already mentioned. But there are like VDEM database as well. The question is whether such huge amount of data would be a good way to go, but at the same time, you could see that measuring effectiveness of the courts became a thing, and indices are kind of main source of information here. What I like in the data that you use are actually surveys conducted by Eurobarometer or ENCJ surveys conducted by experts. So I think this is a kind of refreshing element, which usually is not provided in such kind of comparative tools. Comparing jurisdictions, as Nino mentioned, became problematic when you just compare something out of nowhere, meaning the Mazel law, as an example. The Polish executive decided to compare with the pure legal provisions of the French law, which made absolutely no sense, because the law was from, I don't know, 18 something or 1960 something, and then they tried to compare. You see, this is the law that we are about to introduce in Poland. The same was with comparing the institutional scheme of judicial council in Spain, which turned out missed the most important thing, missed the context. So comparing the Polish draft amendments to the Spanish system turned out to forget what were the problems that the Spanish system was actually facing. So I think the context is the most important element of doing comparative research, how to present the context with the hard data, but also with the understandable soft description, if I may call it like that. What I also liked is something that I'm actually doing research on, is that you provide information about judicial associations that exist in a given jurisdiction. It's not something obvious. To have such data about when you discuss judicial systems. I could imagine that on one hand, the major challenge is how to gather as much data possible, open data that already exist, and they are somewhere in the net. But on the other hand, how to link it with reliable sources and how to provide data that could be actually used by academic, but also by journalists. So for people who are professionals and who need to provide true story and true data, and not just come up with some fake numbers. I guess I will stop here, but I will just want to make one final comment that using comparative argument can be absolutely crucial in debating judiciary and rule of law, but at the same time it can work as a smokescreen. You're discussing Poland, look at Finland. You're discussing Hungary. In Finland there is no constitutional court. How can you discuss and criticize the Hungarian system, and so on and so on? So of course I can imagine that such database will not solve all the problems, but at least it's a kind of easy way to find whether politicians are lying or just messing up with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Basia. And some of the challenges you mentioned, especially with regard to context, I can very much feel them in my bones, as they were part of our conversations on how to shape this hub over the last couple of years. So thank you very much for your insight. And I'm going to turn over the microphone to Marta to talk a little bit about the perspective of somebody who engages in advocacy and signaling issues in the country.
Thank you very much, Jakub, and thank you very much for inviting me. This is when I first started looking at the map and this database, I thought this is an immense, tremendous amount of work, and I want to congratulate you on it. It is probably very, very hard to decide what to put into it and what to leave out. And as you have said, it's also a big challenge to visualize things related to the rule of law. Maybe 2024 will be the year of data visualization in the rule of law domain, because we also just put out what is called a scrollytelling website that tries to explain to an audience how Hungary's EU funds have been suspended, on what basis, for how long, how much. This is an entire labyrinth, and we find it very, very helpful to be able to show to anyone who's interested, NGO partners, journalists, particularly journalists, students, policymakers also, what this means in practice. So all these tools are, I think, very much worth the effort. And in this respect, I think you've done a tremendous job. When we were looking at this map, also I invited a colleague of mine who is our judicial expert. We thought that there are some comments we would like to make that, exactly as Barbara said, go beyond the numbers and dive into the context or the reality. And perhaps this is the hardest, the most challenging aspect of representing something in a visual way, in a comparative way. Because while comparative maps are really enjoyable, but there's always a wealth of information that they keep hidden. And when I look at Hungary, very often Hungary scores pretty well on the effectiveness of its judicial system. When you look at the EU Justice Scoreboard, for example, the Hungarian courts do come out quite well. If you look at this map, it shows you that there is a high number of judges in Hungary. The public purse spends quite a lot on the judiciary. And still we know that partly the reasons for suspension of EU funds to Hungary concern exactly the deficiencies in judicial independence, and most of the super milestones, the key ones, which have been addressed to some extent, maybe not fully so far, focused on judicial safeguards. So what does this mean? How come that on certain aspects Hungary scores so well, but at the same time there's it is found to be wanting? And for example, one of the things that is very hard to portray is the quality of justice. One thing that these numbers perhaps don't show is how many cases get to the courts. So you can always, of course, ensure high access to courts, a high level of access to justice, which would mean you have more cases. But if you, as a matter of policy, restrict access to courts by, for example, making it very expensive or requiring attorneys to participate in court procedures without which cases would be inadmissible, then this makes it harder for people to access courts. So there's already less cases to deal with. Also, what we've seen in the Hungarian case, beyond the general access to courts, is that in, for example, criminal cases, of course, the prosecution has a key role in being either, it's a gatekeeper for cases to get to court. So in certain cases, they will never reach the courts, and therefore, if we look at court statistics, we won't get the general picture. This is true for cases which the Hungarian Helsinki Committee has been taking for many years, for example, related to police ill treatment, where it's really, really hard to get a case just before a judge. Another thing that, of course, ordinary court systems and their data won't show us is how the Constitutional Court reviews individual cases and whether its politicization will influence the quality of justice in general. Also, in the case of Hungary, the Hungarian Supreme Court has a tool to ensure that there would be unified judicial decision-making, which can give a mandatory interpretation to judicial decisions. And there's a lot of critical remarks about how professional are these tools, whether they can put in an element of political influence. I think one thing that the map shows really well is, sadly, the non-implementation of judgments. So if I click on that, Hungary comes out as a glaring, well, badly performing country, sadly. And this, of course, will tell us about cases that involve a human rights element. And very often we find in the Hungarian context that, in general, ordinary cases could be processed by the courts rather swiftly or without significant concerns about judicial independence in the instant case, while certain cases that are sensitive, politically sensitive, for example, involving high-level corruption scandals, will take forever. And there will be various ways to drag on cases so that they remain almost unresolved. And this, of course, would fall, I guess, into the statistical error category. And at the same time, they give us a very clear warning signal about the politicization of the justice system. And this is something that is reflected in the Commission's rule of law reports too. Further, judicial independence safeguards are also hard to show. For example, how are the highest judicial office holders appointed? What is their career path? In the Hungarian case, one of the very serious concerns is that the person has no judicial career before he was appointed to lead Hungary's judiciary. Another aspect is, of course, the level of judicial salaries. And this is, of course, also a budgetary constraint, But when we see how the Hungarian judges, when they start out their careers, are paid, I think this gives an indication of what kind of attractiveness this career path holds. And currently, sadly, a starting judicial salary at the very first step of the scale comes to a little under €1,000 net. So this is also a very significant factor. We think this shows that Hungary's judiciary is under-resourced, even if we spend a lot of money on the judicial system. As a last idea, maybe one could try to think of including the rule of law reports, recommendations, and their follow-up or the lack of them in some visual way. Of course, not all countries would have these recommendations, but those that do, these are key to follow up. So that's perhaps a way to advance this already extremely comprehensive and intricate map. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, for this perspective. And now I'm going to ask Daniel to talk a lot about his experiences of someone who was working and covering news from a country which has a Supreme Court, a Supreme Administrative Court, a Constitutional Tribunal, and a State Tribunal, and how he manages to navigate this complex landscape.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation today, and thank you for creating this fantastic tool. I've begun to explore all the options in there. There's a lot of them, and there's a huge amount of information there. But as I think Barbara said as well, it's well-chosen information. There's a lot of useful, accessible information there, but it doesn't overwhelm you, and it's very, very easy to use the system. What I'd say from a media journalism perspective is that journalists like anything that makes their lives easier. That's not because we're lazy, although in some cases we are lazy. It's because unlike academics or people who work in NGOs, we're not specialists on a lot of the topics we cover, probably most of the topics we cover in some cases. Very often, we know little at all about a story before we start covering it. So any resource like this, where in a single centralized place you can access reliable, rich, useful information, is extremely helpful to journalists trying to cover this kind of story. Notes from Poland, for example, we're a very small organization. There's only 4 of us working in the news team, only 2 of us full-time. And so that means we can't specialize in areas. In some of us maybe know a bit more about certain topics than others, but we generally have to cover topics that we're not specialized in. So any tool like this is extremely useful for us. One thing in particular, I think that it's helpful and will be helpful with for us is cutting through the competing political narratives you see around rule of law issues in Poland. So as journalists, we try to offer balance in our stories. We try to present quotes, arguments, perspectives from both sides, or sometimes more than 2 sides, regarding rule of law stories. But also we want to give readers a sense of how to interpret and understand those narratives, and that means providing factual information. And this tool is going to be very useful for doing that. A couple of examples would be, and this is something, for example, that both Nina and Barbara mentioned earlier, which is that in Poland, especially the former Law and Justice government would often argue that reforms it was making to the judiciary were simply modelled on or were similar to the types of systems that exist in certain Western European countries. And as journalists, it's hard for us to assess that. We have to dig into various sources of information, looking for information about those Western judicial systems, and having a database like this is going to be really useful to be able to use the comparative tools, or just to dig into individual country reports to better assess the claims made by certain politicians in Poland that this judicial system is similar to that one, and so on. Similarly to that as well, an argument often heard in Poland is that Poland, but generally the Eastern European Union member states, are treated with double standards, that they are criticized for and sometimes legally challenged over actions or reforms that go unpunished or unnoticed or uncommented on in Western Europe. And I think, as Nina was showing us when she previewed or looked through the map and the tool, it actually shows that across Europe there are challenges, there's criticism, that Spain was on one of those maps was shown as being moderately poor on implementing rulings, that there is questions about the prosecutorial system in France and Germany. So I think, again, this tool is going to be useful for assessing and cutting through some of these narratives from politicians that as journalists we have to report, but we also want to contextualize to help readers to understand. I think that the combination of data along with very accessible, understandable explanations is really useful. I like, for example, the polling data across countries showing how the public view the judicial system in different countries. I think that's a really useful way of comparing and again cutting through some of these narratives from politicians by showing what the public actually think about reforms that have taken place and about the judicial system over time. And then I think the sections looking at the challenges each country faces and the judgments pending implementation are also very useful. As journalists, these are exactly the kind of things we have to cover quickly, and we need to provide background and context to ongoing issues like these, and having this collected together in one place is really useful. Just to finish, a couple of points about going forward with this. And I know you've already mentioned that there will be regular updates, and I think that's really important. There are so many projects that begin with great intentions and often with a great product, but then dry up over time as interest wanes or the organization moves on to something else or funding dries up. This tool is extremely useful, but will only continue to be useful if it's regularly updated, and especially as journalists as well, who have to cover things quickly and as they develop, it's going to be important for us to know that the information there is as fresh and current and up to date as it can be. Also, one thing that I didn't come across while I was looking through, I didn't look at everything in there, so maybe I've missed it, but it certainly wasn't obvious to me. There were great country profiles and comparative tools, but I didn't see a section on the European justice system in terms of European courts, so European Union and Council of Europe. I think it would also be very useful for journalists and perhaps others too, to have clear explanations and data on how the European court systems work, on important cases that are pending, perhaps and rule of law procedures that have been launched against EU countries. So I think, as well as having the national perspective, having a clearer section on the European judicial system as well would be very useful too. And that's all from me, and happy to hear any questions anyone has.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and especially thank you for your comments and suggestions regarding the expansion of the map, because this beautifully segues into the question we already received. A kind reminder to our participants: if you want to ask a question, use the chat or the Q&A section so that we can see what's coming our way. But we have a wonderful question regarding the hub, and actually it's a couple of points to answer this, and it comes to what data set is our key challenges feature based. It is an open list of sources. What will the expansion that we mentioned cover? And what about going beyond the judiciary? Nina, if you could maybe speak a few words to this.
Yes, great question, because I probably didn't have time throughout the presentation to cover this. Our section of key challenges is essentially something that we produced at DRI, or I can take responsibility for that, but it is obviously based on a variety of sources that are out there, open list sources. This includes academic work from national experts, but I also, for a large number of jurisdictions, did interviews with national experts. We have a broad network of reconstitution fellows that come from many of the EU member states. Then I engaged with the civil society organizations. There are very useful reports from Marta's organization and many other organizations that we try to give more visibility to, even if they're very visible already. But this was a compilation of many different resources. I was very aware, and it's a very fair point, to keep in mind the context, history, and political culture that's in a particular country, and that is very difficult to grasp from the legal sources or sources on paper. And from that standpoint, it's important to look at the academic research, for example, that is being done through interviews, socio-legal research, and talk to experts on the ground as well. So some of that is already integrated there, and we intend to continue, because those factors really make a difference in terms of how bad or good situation is in a given country. You might have a lack of formal guarantees in Germany or in Hungary, in similar at the surface, but consequences may be very different. And the choice obviously was very random of countries. Regarding the updates, we definitely, it's very important, like already mentioned, to do updates to make this instrument viable. And this is what we plan to do to an extent of an ability, even though it's very difficult to follow 27 countries. However, we think of covering and providing relatively immediate analysis on most important developments. And when I was working on the profiles, I realized that even before finishing all profiles, I had to update the ones that were already finished because something happened. So we are aiming at that, and we'll remove the challenges if we see that the country no longer suffers from any of the problems. That will be also the kind of update that we will provide. And we will try to balance, I will also try to balance and include positive aspects of it, because the picture is a lot more complex usually than one or the other parameter. Like as also Marta mentioned, efficiency is great in Hungary, but all the rest doesn't look very good. So just to show the complex picture. Yes. I think the speakers' comments are very helpful in a sense that they showed me that we have to be really factoring a lot of things in this map, and we are on in good direction, but we'll continue working, obviously. Thank you very much.
Maybe I will also add that we've already gone a little bit outside of the judiciary with the hub as it is, because several of the challenges and information that we put in refers, for example, to prosecution services, which is not a traditionally part of the judiciary, and in many countries it exists outside of the traditional division of powers. However, since this is very closely linked, and we are looking at countries like Poland, for example, where the Minister of Justice is also the Prosecutor General, and in practice, there is a strong and discussion-worthy overlap. There is a space that we already decided to explore, but we will, of course, be open to expanding it. And in particular, the comment about including perhaps data on the European courts, the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice of the European Union is very good. However, we already do have quite a lot of data in individual countries where we look at the key judgments related to the rule of law that come from both courts and speak about the given country. I am not seeing any further questions coming from our participants. So perhaps this is a good moment to thank you all for participating in this launch, and especially to our panelists for joining us and providing their perspectives. Definitely, we encourage all of you to explore the Judiciary Hub and to follow it, bookmark it, and we will be updating and expanding in the coming weeks with new functionalities and new data. But also beyond that, we have several other projects, both as part of reconstitution work on the rule of law and our further new initiatives on the in the European Union and beyond. So please follow Democracy Reporting International and check out what we are doing elsewhere. And we will have some exciting news and new projects that we will be unveiling in the coming weeks and months. Once again, thank you all very much for today, and looking forward to meeting you soon in other events and being able to showcase you more of our work. Thank you very much.